Well, thanks very much, Luke. It looks like we're on the home straight now, so we're getting there, brothers and sisters. Sometimes we see people in the truth who just blow us away because of the dedication and the level of effort and the effort that they put into things generally. It might be some big thing that we see someone do. We think, well, I don't know if I would have done that, but they do it. Or it might be something a little smaller, like kind of that widow and the last mite principle. And either way, it's just so impressive because it says a lot about the dedication of that person. It can be quite inspiring. Well, as we saw last session, how the combined power of Solomon's wisdom on one hand, and that ability he had to work with other people, how those things enabled him to achieve some really incredible things. We're now going to see, I hope, how as he starts to finish off the temple and it actually comes time to commission it or dedicate it, is the phrase the scriptures use, how this all kind of comes together. And here I hope we're going to see how Solomon, he kind of was one of those people. He was just such a dedicated individual. And we see that particularly through the record we're going to look at now, which is this temple dedication process. Not surprisingly, that's why it's called the dedication. Solomon at this phase of his life was one of those people who was just so committed to God, and it was just jaw-dropping to behold, and I hope we see that in the record. So much so impressive was it, so effective was it in terms of engaging people in this whole activity, that the effects of it actually filled the whole kingdom from end to end. People were affected by what he did on this occasion. But we are also going to see how, as he finished the temple, he turned his talent to other things. Pursuits that were not wrong in themselves, and that's kind of the key. But they just represented a bit of a change of focus for Solomon. And as much as I do hope we're going to be really impressed with the details of that dedicated service around the commencement of the temple operation, I do think we'll find it kind of insightful to see where his troubles really started. So anyway, let's start at the dedication. So we left off in the last session looking at how Solomon assembled those two big teams. So we had that overarching team that was governing the nation, and then sort of a team within the team was that construction alliance, as I called it, that he stood up to deliver the temple project. And as we turn to the record back to 1 Kings, we'll go to 1 Kings again, we see that ultimately he was successful. He pulled it off, the whole thing worked, and the temple was built. So if you go to 1 Kings 6, here, right at the end there, at verse 37, it talks about this, where it says, "In the 4th year was the foundation of the house of Yahweh laid." So that's where it all started, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month. "And in the 11th year, in the month Bul, which is the 8th month, was the house finished throughout all the parts thereof, and according to all the fashion of it. So was he 7 years in building it," a little closer to 7.5 years. So the temple's foundation was laid in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month of the 4th year of his reign. And then moving forward to the month Bul, which was the 8th month of his 11th year, you've got yourself about 7.5 years. So that's how long it took from start to finish in terms of the construction phase. We know there was a whole bunch of planning and all that sort of logistics and all that sort of stuff ahead of that, but the construction phase took 7.5 years. And I think most of us have got a feel for the temple, that it was enormous. It was incredibly intricate. It was a phenomenal piece of work. And when we appreciate that, I think we can all reflect on what happened here and say that this was just an incredible feat. It was absolutely mind-blowing. You might have got a feel for that in the last session at the end there, where we looked at just how many people were involved. There's 150 plus thousand people working on this thing for that time period. It was just unbelievable, the complexities, and imagine all the headaches of going through that. But they did pull it off, and the temple was finished, and I'm sure it was absolutely immaculate, because as we saw earlier, compromising quality wasn't really in David's DNA, and I'm sure it wasn't in Solomon's DNA. But it's interesting that after the construction was completed, the temple wasn't actually put into service straight away. It was actually quite a long time later that it happened. because it did need to be dedicated, or as I sort of think of it, as like commissioned. And unlike Solomon's first coronation, you might recall that his first coronation was a bit rushed because it just had to be to deal with Adonijah quick smart. This would not be like that. This would not be a rushed event. This was God's temple, okay? So it had to be careful, it had to be regal. So moving forward, no less than 11 months, quite a long time, from the completion date that we saw there, the 8th of the 11th year, we come to this momentous occasion of the dedication of the temple. If you look at, come to 1 Kings chapter 8, we can see a record of this, where it says, 1 Kings 8 verse 1, "Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the chief of the fathers of the children of Israel, unto King Solomon in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the ark of the covenant of Yahweh out of the city of David, which is Zion." Verse 2, "And all the men of Israel assembled themselves unto King Solomon at the feast in the month Ethanim, which is the 7th month." So we see, again, just a bit of an artist's representation. There they are bringing the ark, which is one of the processions, as we'll see in a minute, that was involved here. So this happened in the 7th month, presumably in the 12th year. It doesn't say it, but it's inferred that it was in the 12th year of Solomon's reign. And I say that because if it wasn't in the 12th year, if it was in the 11th year, they would have been doing this just as they were putting the finishing touches in that last month on the temple, and that, I don't think that would have fitted the regal nature of the event. So it's almost certainly in the 12th year of Solomon's reign that this happened, 11 months after it was completed. Which raises an interesting question. Why would you take so long? He spent all this time, everyone's so excited, finishing off the temple. Imagine the excitement. And then they get to the completion, and everyone's thinking, all right, let's get it going, let's use it. And Solomon says, we're going to wait 11 months before we actually start to use it. And, I just think it's interesting to think about questions like that when we read the Bible as to why things are going on. And on one level, I think you can sort of answer it simplistically by saying that it was a really important event and Solomon would have wanted to ensure that it went really well and it was really special, and to do that, you probably couldn't just sort of slap it together in a couple of weeks, right? It probably needed some period of time to really get things together. So I think there was probably an element of he needed time to plan it. So Solomon talks about planning in Proverbs 30 verse 25, the answer of people not strong and yet they prepare their meat in the summer. So that verse is all about planning. Solomon understood that was good practice, and I'm sure that would have applied here. But I still don't know that it explains the full 11 months. That is a really long time. And I think the best way to explain it is to think about what particular month, waiting 11 months, what particular time that landed the event on, because it was actually the 7th month. And the 7th month, those of you who are experts on feasts and that sort of thing, which I'm not, it will know that by doing that, the event occurred the same time as the Feast of Tabernacles, which was to occur on the 15th, or commence on the 15th of that month. That is recorded in Leviticus 23. So I'm going to put a few quotes up that sort of tie together here. We're not going to necessarily turn them up. Feel free to do it if you would like. But yeah, so Leviticus 23 verse 39 describes the Feast of the Tabernacles. It says, "In the 15th day of the 7th month, ye shall dwell in booths 7 days, that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths, when I brought them out of the land of Egypt." So the Feast of Tabernacles was really, I think a lot of us already know this, it was just about reminding the Jews of the wilderness wanderings and kind of reminding them of that difficult period where they were essentially homeless. And it was about being appreciative of the fact that they weren't like that anymore, and God's given them this land now to rest in. So I think that's largely what the Feast of Tabernacles was about. And of course, what was happening here at the temple dedication was kind of the antithesis of that. So it's a contrast, because in contrast to those continual movements of God's ark up until this point in history, particularly in the wilderness wanderings, where it was really prominent, having dwelt in the ark, having had to dwell in all these booths, as it were, and move around, Solomon was now going to complete the work that his father had set out to do, to bring the ark home, as it were, to give it a resting place. David had actually spoken about this exact thing at Solomon's second coronation, which was, so we go to 1 Chronicles 28, and I'll just pull up this single verse. 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 2, he said on that occasion, whoop, that didn't come up, there we go. He said on that occasion, "As for me, I had in my heart to build a house." So this is David speaking. "I had in my heart to build a house of rest for the ark of the covenant of Yahweh." So he styled it a house of rest. That's what he called the temple. It was a house of rest. And so it is this idea of a house of rest for the ark. And later then at the temple dedication, Solomon picks up that kind of language and he uses it. And it's in the Chronicles record actually of this, where in 2 Chronicles 6:41 he says, "Now therefore arise, O Yahweh God, into thy resting place." A very similar language that he appears to have drawn from his father. He understood this also was kind of this, it's this idea of a resting place for God's people and for the ark. So the concurrence of the temple dedication with the Feast of Tabernacles, I don't think it was a coincidence. So it was probably by design. This was all about finishing off that work. It was work that Joshua actually started when he brought the ark into the land. He had the same sentiments, if you want to go back and look at that. Solomon wanted to bring the ark to rest, and thereby he was going to honour God and create this sense of permanency for God's people using the temple. No more wilderness wanderings for them. That was the sentiment of this occasion. That's what he was trying to underline with everything he was doing here. But it's interesting to just stop and think about this, because although it all fits and you think, well, that's very nice, of course, we know it's actually not quite right, is it? Because it didn't actually happen that way. They didn't actually find a permanent resting place, did they? They sinned. The Babylonians eventually came down several centuries later, and they wiped out the whole thing. They took them away. The temple was wrecked, and it didn't. So the permanency wasn't ultimately found to be there. It was there for a long time, for sure, but it wasn't truly permanent. And this much, I think, as much as there is this emphasis on the rest and all this sort of thing, I think also there is an awareness, certainly in Solomon's mind, that this was the case. That they knew deep down this would not necessarily be the end, or it would not be the end. And the reason, it's just a subtle inference, but it's this interesting reference in the King's record. I'll put it up there from the ESV. Oh, I did it again. Okay, you can see that. So there's this reference to the poles that they used to transport the ark, and it's quite curious to see the fact that they actually just left them sticking into these rings that were used to move the ark. They just left them there, and it sort of looked a bit awkward. So 1 Kings 8, verse 8 in ESV, the poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary. So they were sticking out of the curtain from the most holy, and you could see them in the holy place. But they couldn't be seen from the outside, and they are there to this day. And I think that's the key phrase. They are still there. Whoever wrote this saying, they're still there, everyone knows they're there. Those poles are still stuck in the ark. And the reason for that, again, why would you do that? Why would you leave them there? Almost would have looked a little out of place, I would have thought. And this is sort of the key point we're getting to here. Now, on one hand, simplistically, you can say, well, they had to leave them there because actually, the law said they had to leave them there. Exodus 25:15. The poles, it was sort of a commandment. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark. They shall not be taken from it. So there you go. There's your answer. But of course, we know the law. There's always reasons behind the law. And it's good to think about, well, what's the reason behind the reason? Well, the reason behind the reason, I think, why did the law actually say that? Was that despite the symbolism that we see at the temple dedication, I think there was, and despite it was a good intent, right? Despite all that, And despite the fact this was the most permanent they would ever kind of get, and it really was in Israel's history, this whole setup and the kingdom that followed, the temple, everything. This was not the permanent dwelling place for the ark. This was not the end for Israel. This was not the kingdom, if you like. And this sentiment, I think, is picked up beautifully by the Apostle Paul in Hebrews chapter 4 and at verse 8, where he writes, "For if Jesus," or you might say Solomon, perhaps, "if Jesus had given them rest, then would he not afterwards have spoken of another day? There remaineth therefore a rest for the people of God." And I think that string of quotes there kind of gives you the full picture as to what was going on at the temple dedication. That I think is truly the principle Solomon is honouring here. He's not saying this is it, you're in the kingdom, everybody. But it's pointing forward to the kingdom. It's getting people excited about the kingdom and their hope and the long-term vision. That's, I think, really what it's about. The temple dedication, the temple itself, in many respects, was pointing forward to the kingdom of God. And it was about getting people, even people like us who look back and read it now, excited about the kingdom and looking forward to the kingdom, knowing that this what we're experiencing now in this world, and even what they were experiencing in that world, it is not the kingdom, it is not our permanent dwelling place. We are looking for something else. And that was the principle of the Feast of Tabernacles as well. And that, I think, is probably why Solomon waited a full 11 months to make sure he could line the whole thing up with the Feast of Tabernacles, probably. So, probably not a coincidence. And so after that long 11-month wait, the day came when they would bring the ark in. So if you go to chapter 8, 1 Kings and verse 3, we can read about this, where it says, "And all the elders of Israel came, and the priests took up the ark. And they brought up the ark of Yahweh and the tabernacle of the congregation, and all the holy vessels that were in the tabernacle, even those did the priests and the Levites bring up." So it's kind of moving day, isn't it? There's two processions of things that are being brought to the temple. The ark was being brought up from the south, from Zion, and then from the north, and because that's where it had been for a period. And then from the north, there was another procession of gear coming down from Gibeon, so we know about that because that's where Solomon went and did that sacrifice. And there was things there like the tabernacle, as we saw. So the various items were taken from each of those sites, and they were all brought together in these processions into the temple. We read on in verse 5, "King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel that were assembled unto him were with him before the ark, sacrificing sheep and oxen that could not be numbered for multitude." We're going to return to that in a second. "And the priests brought in the ark of the covenant of Yahweh unto his place, into the oracle of the house, to the most holy place, even under the wings of the cherubim." So the ark goes into the most holy place, as we would expect. That's where it belonged. And then the record, it's actually silent as to where all those other things that were now superseded, really, like the tabernacle, as to where they went. We don't know where they went, but they were obviously brought there for a reason. So presumably they went somewhere in the temple, and really the only place they could go was those side rooms. There were side rooms in the temple, so probably they went in there, but we don't know that for sure. And those side rooms didn't have any other obvious role necessarily, so that would kind of fit. So anyhow, we've read verses 7 and 8, and we saw there that the ark sort of comes to its semi-permanent, we'll call it now, resting place in the most holy. And then with that, there's all this beautiful music and praise happening in the background, and with that occurring in the background, God sort of descends in this cloud. We read about that in chapter 8 and at verse 10. "It came to pass when the priests were come out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of Yahweh, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of Yahweh had filled the house of Yahweh." So in a sign of God's approval, I think, and of what Solomon was doing here, this cloud kind of comes down and fills the area. And the priests actually had to just run out of there because it was dangerous. They couldn't see. It was probably quite intimidating seeing God's presence descend to this area where they were. They knew what it was. Leviticus 16:2 talks about God appearing in the cloud of the mercy seat. So they would have understood this cloud was representative of the presence of God. So it could have been exciting on one hand, but kind of intimidating on another hand. And then seeing this great miracle, which was, I think, a sign of God's approval, I would imagine Solomon would have been absolutely elated, because this, I suppose, was the recognition that what he had done after all that work, it was acceptable. He had done it well. The quality was sound. Everything was right. And God was really happy with what he had done. So this would have been, I think, a wonderful, wonderful moment for Solomon to witness. And then what he does, Solomon turns around to the people and he looks to draw them, as he did, we saw that at Gibeon, he looks to draw them into the occasion. And he does it commencing with this stirring speech which he gives. And it starts, we're not going to go through it blow by blow, but it starts in verse 14. Got another picture there of him standing there giving this speech, which he had planned quite carefully. It actually runs right through to verse 21. I say he planned it carefully because, I mean, we pretty well know by now he planned everything that needed to be planned carefully very well. And there's a really interesting little reference that reinforces this in 2 Chronicles 6 and at verse 13. So again, in the parallel record, where it tells you that he purpose-built before the event this speaking platform, and you can sort of get a sense of it there. I think the artist has picked up that he's standing on a platform because he figured, I suppose, that there's going to be lots of people and he wants them to hear him, I guess a little bit like what we do here. And so he stands up on this platform that he had prepared prior to make sure everyone can hear him. So yeah, in verses 14 to 21, he gives this wonderful speech and he points out lots of things, but he points out particularly how that day David's desire to find a resting place for the ark, we know about that theme now, how that had been fulfilled. He makes that very clear. It's interesting though, as you read through it, to see, I mentioned David, how often Solomon does that in this speech. Verse 15, if you like Bible marking, not a bad thing to Bible mark. Don't feel obligated to do it now. But verse 15 talks about David. Verse 16 talks about David. Verse 17, verse 18, verse 20, and later on in his prayer, which we'll look at in a second. Brethren and sisters, David had been dead for about 10 years. But he was still in the front of his son's mind. Solomon wanted to share the credit with his dad. He was just full of respect for his parents. He was such a respectful young man. 10 years. And it was, of course, respect that his brothers, it wasn't like all the kids were like it. He was different. His older brothers just were the complete and utter opposite. And they never developed that respect for their parents. So it was a credit to Solomon. So anyhow, he goes on, verses 22 to 53, is a record of a prayer, really beautiful prayer, as you'd expect, that he gives to God, but it's a communal one, wherever, again, everyone gets involved. And in that, he says a lot of things, of course, but generally he's appealing for justice. And there's this tone of almost ahead of time appealing for forgiveness, because it's like he knew that they would muck up, and they did, of course. He did. And in fact, the whole nation did. And he almost, in advance, acknowledges that they would make mistakes and invokes God's forgiveness. And then finally, in verses 54 to 61, he again goes back to, he sort of finishes the speech, if you like. He goes back to addressing the congregation, amongst other things, blessing the congregation. Which, if you think about it, is something a bit unusual about that. Whose job was it to bless the congregation? The priest. I saw someone lip sync the priest. Numbers 6, verse 23 to 27. But where is Zadok in this record? He's not there. I'll be quite shocked if you find the verse where he's there, because I don't think he's there. Unlike the sacrifice at Gibeon being in the wrong place, as it was, despite having the right motive, it was the wrong place. The mechanics were not right. This is not the case here. This is something different again. And clearly it's not like Isaiah, where he, sometime later, he would go in and do a very similar thing. Burn incense in the altar, at the altar. Playing priest, essentially, a king playing priest. But there was no leprosy for Solomon as there was for him. Somehow, and I think Solomon knew it, this was divinely endorsed. This, brothers and sisters, is the king priest. This is, of course, a powerful type of Jesus Christ our Lord, and perhaps more than anywhere else in the record of Solomon. And Solomon's story is absolutely full of typical references to Christ, especially in the kingdom, especially that phase. It is staggering. So much so, I actually don't think I've said this so far, but I should make the point that I have not really focused on the types at all. Sometimes you just can't help it though, like this, where it's just so clearly in the record, you've got to sort of mention it. But if you actually, if I or anyone was to really spend lots of time going through the typical aspects of Solomon's life in the record, we'd be up for a lot more than 4 talks. There is so much material about this. He is a very, very, very strong type of Christ. I think most of us know that, and it's quite fascinating to look at that. But I won't be spending a great deal of time on that because just from a time perspective. But in this case, you just can't avoid it. It's such a powerful point in the record. He is absolutely here a very, very powerful type of our Lord Jesus Christ, King and priest, civil leader and religious leader, all integrated into one. And the dedication that Solomon showed here, it was befitting of that role. It was befitting of the king priest that he was prefiguring. It becomes even clearer when we see the details of how much, I touched on it as we read through it, how much he actually sacrificed on that day. It is quite amazing. Look at chapter 8, verse 62, which has this detail, where it says, "And the king and all Israel with him offered sacrifice before Yahweh. And Solomon offered a sacrifice of peace offerings, which he offered unto Yahweh, 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the children of Israel dedicated the house of Yahweh. The same day did the king hallow the middle court that was before the house of Yahweh, for there he offered burnt offerings." So this is like an overflow area because he couldn't actually use the brazen altar alone. It was too small. And meal offerings and fat of the peace offerings, because the brazen altar that was before Yahweh was too little to receive the burnt offerings and meal offerings and the fat of the peace offerings. Brothers and sisters, the brazen altar was enormous. But despite that, they needed overflow. They couldn't actually get all the sacrifices processed using that. And you think, well, how so? Well, look at the number. That's how so. 142,000 animals. Now, it's hard to say for sure, but I think that is probably the innumerable multitude, or that kind of language that we see in verse 5. I think that is the 142,000. It's not some, that plus 142,000 is probably a reasonable reading of the record. So let's just say it was only, dare I say that, only 142,000 animals, but it's quite mind-blowing figures. Let's put it into context. At Solomon's second coronation, David supplied 3,000 animals. Remember, 142 is what Solomon did here. At Asa's reformation, 7,700. At Hezekiah's reformation, 19,000. At Josiah's, 45,000. At Ezra's, 700. Because, of course, that was the day of small things, wasn't it? When they'd come back from the land, from the land of Babylon. Solomon, 142,000. And that, of course, we've got to be careful here. This is not to say that those occasions were somehow inferior because of those numbers. We're not saying that. Again, the widow on the last mite just sort of debunks that theory. But suffice to say that Solomon's dedication here is quite remarkable. It is quite remarkable. It demonstrated a very, very committed approach to God. And I think it shows he was actively leading. You see how he always wants to involve other people. He was actively leading God's people in the very direction where he himself was heading, just like he started off at Gibeon. And the more we read this record, the more I think we see, particularly 1 Kings 8, you see this theme of dedication, and particularly Solomon's dedication. It was just incredible. Obviously, the very fact that he finished the temple testifies to that. That would have been incredibly difficult. But here, when it comes to the occasion or the event of the dedication, it's like he just wanted to finish everything on this real high. He wasn't just happy to say, oh, I finished it, let's just slap together something, it'll be all right, the temple's been accepted. He wanted to finish on a high. It really was a big, big sacrifice for him. And of course, it's a good example, isn't it, for us to consider. It's not rocket science to see the lesson here for ourselves, is it? When we think about how much we are dedicating to God and to His service, to other people in the meeting, sometimes it's quite difficult doing different things, ecclesial duties or little things that aren't even on the record, as it were. It can be quite hard. It's very easy, if you're anything like me, it's pretty easy to make excuses. The best excuse, if you're looking for an excuse, this is a good one, I'm sure you already know it, is you're busy. I'm busy. I'm flat out. Because you know what, it's a good excuse, because it's true. It's a really good one. We are so busy, right? But it's not. Solomon was pretty busy, I can assure you. But he still found a way to get this all together. Somehow he got this organised, and he brought all these resources together, and he did this. I think that is the critical lesson of 1 Kings 8, just the dedication that is being demonstrated from someone who, frankly, was too busy, Solomon, and he did it. So anyhow, Solomon, he goes on to hold this 14-day feast for all the nation, again, getting everybody involved. We read about that in verse 65, where it says, "At that time Solomon held a feast, and all Israel with him, a great congregation from the entering of Hamath unto the river of Egypt before Yahweh our God. 7 days and 7 days, even 14 days. And on the 8th day he sent the people away, and they blessed the king and went unto their tents joyful and glad of heart for all the goodness that Yahweh had done for David, his servant," so you see David there again, "and for Israel, his people." So the celebrations took place from the Nile, down there in Egypt, right up to Hamath, which is about a couple of hundred k's north of Damascus. So a huge area was influenced by this activity. It wasn't just a Jerusalem thing, it was everybody getting involved in some form. It was quite immense. And they were joyful and they were glad, as it says there. This was a great time for everybody, but particularly for Solomon, who was at the centre of it all. And any doubts at this point as to his capability were long, long gone. He was, at this point in the record, he is supreme. He is absolutely supreme. His brilliant approach actually even inspired another king, which is, I would suggest to you, is Hezekiah. Some of you may be aware, Hezekiah was, I think he was particularly fond of Solomon. He was involved in the compilation of some of his works, like the Proverbs and such. But if you look at the way he ran his Reformation, you get the feeling that he really liked how Solomon operated. Now, I don't want to spend long on this. I just sort of put it up, and if you're really keen, I can sort of take you through the quotes yesterday. I don't think you'll be able to write them down quick enough. I'm not going to put them up for long, but very quickly. You can try and write them down if you're real quick. But here's a couple of comparisons to the two. So and mainly around the Reformations they both held, if you like, this isn't so much a Reformation Solomon's doing, but it's sort of like that. It's the temple dedication. But Hezekiah had a Reformation, and a lot of elements were common. Too many sacrifices, common issue you see between the two records. They both had those problems. Hezekiah, the brazen altar that was before Yahweh was too little to receive burnt offerings. Priest performing music, so there was priests involved, there was lots of music, common element. The 7 plus 7 days, common element. Hezekiah did the same thing. Unity, there was a really strong theme of unity in both cases as they looked to bring all the people together. The repairing of Millo, that's not actually part of the Reformation, but it's just a curious little detail. They both repaired the Millo. Nobody else did that. And then finally, there's a reference there. I'll read the reference to Hezekiah, 2 Chronicles 32:27. And Hezekiah had exceeding much riches and honour. Does that sound familiar? Yes, it does. That is exactly how Solomon is described in the divine record. They were kind of similar. And I think Hezekiah, to an extent, gave a lot of thought to how Solomon operated. And when you look at the good version of Solomon that we're seeing here, it's not hard to see why. He was just fantastic at doing this sort of thing. So, do you want me to leave that up, or will it distract you? Johnny Saxon wants it up. Sorry. All right, we'll leave it there. So, suffice to say, dedicated service can be such a powerful thing, brothers and sisters. But the converse can also be true, can't it? We can probably all relate to this particularly, right? The dedication he demonstrated, that's a little harder to relate to sometimes, but this issue of the opposite of that, which is an issue he started to have, of losing focus, is something I think we can all relate to. And this, I believe, is where Solomon's troubles really started. After the excitement of the temple dedication subsided and things kind of returned to normal, Solomon was at a juncture. And he had to make a decision broadly between two paths. There was really two options, broadly. It's never quite that clear, is it? But let's say there was two broad options. The first one, I think it would have had to be quite deliberate and purposeful had he done this, purposely wind down all that building machine that he had created, all that capability, all the wonderful contracts he set up and the people and everything. He could have deliberately said, the temple's done, let's start to turn it off. And it would have been actually quite an effort, because imagine the impetus that it had. And having done that, he could kind of settle down a bit, perhaps shift his focus to less impressive things, less impressive certainly than building the temple, maybe to focus a little more on his subjects, maybe focus a little bit more on his family, maybe even one or two of his wives. Or he could take all that talent and capability that he had developed for building the temple, and he could kind of take it a bit further, and he could use it to build other things. Not so much for God this time, just a little more for himself this time around. And we know what he did. He did the second. He took option 2. He didn't wind the machine down. He kept it going. And so he moved on to the palace project, and we have a record of that at the start of 1 Kings chapter 7. But before we read that, I'll just point one important detail out. This is like the 2 coronation thing I mentioned to you before. It really confused me when I was looking at this, until you rely on someone else's work and they give you the answers, which is what I did. I think it was similar with this. The sequence of the chapters is out, okay? And it's confusing because it's not chronological. Because the temple dedication is recorded in chapter 8 of 1 Kings. I'm talking about 1 Kings here. That happened as the palace project was just kind of warming up, but that's in chapter 7, so they're not quite in order, I don't think. And I'll suggest a reason to that. I think it's very, very deliberate, and I'll suggest why in a second. Anyhow, let's just first of all read 1 Kings chapter 6. Now, we've read 1 Kings 6 verse 38, but I want to read it again. You might wonder why I would do that. And it's because I believe this is one of those chapter breaks that is incredibly unhelpful. This is not a good chapter break. We know the chapter breaks aren't inspired, so I guess it's not surprising that sometimes they're not all that helpful. And we're just going to read from 38 and keep going through 7 verse 1. So it says, in the 11th year, the month Bul, which is the 8th month, was the house finished throughout all the parts thereof, and according to the fashion of it. So was he 7 years in building it. But Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished all his house. And I would suggest to you, if you probably formed this view yourself already, that the key word in verse 1 is the word but. Some translations render it and, but whatever the case, I really think there is a contrast being made here to what went before. What went before? a 7-year temple project. What's happened now? A 13-year palace project. This is something new in verse 1 of chapter 7. This is not the temple project anymore. That was a great work of dedication to God, as we just discussed. And now this is something different. We go on to read in verse 2. He built also the house of the forest of Lebanon. The length thereof was 100 cubits, and the breadth thereof 50 cubits, and the height thereof 30 cubits, upon 4 rows of cedar pillars, with cedar beams upon the pillars. And that word also actually isn't, I don't think, particularly helpful at the start of that verse, the third word there, because it's actually left out of most translations, or some, like the ASV, render the verse like this. It says, "For he built the house of the forest of Lebanon." And if we sort of don't correct that, you end up thinking that the house of the forest of Lebanon was some other project over and above the palace, but it wasn't actually the case. The descriptions after verse 1 is the detail of the palace. There are 5 components to the palace, and this is what they are. First one, the house of the forest of Lebanon. The second one, the porch of pillars, or the pillar hall, some translations put it. The third one, the porch of judgment, or the justice hall. That's where the ivory throne he had that was covered in gold, that's where that would have likely gone. Then there was the king's house, fourth, and then sort of hanging off that was his wife's house, number 5. So they were the 5 components. So it was quite a complex palace with lots of different components. But I think where this record gets most interesting is when you start to directly compare the palace and the temple. And I think we are absolutely meant to do that. And that's why I think that chapter break's not great. It is the reason they're out of order is because the divine mind is ramming these two things, these two projects, right next to each other. So it's inviting us to compare, because the comparison is insightful. Look at the differences. I'll put these up on the screen. You finished, Johnny? Yeah. All right. Look at the differences. Temple versus palace. The dimensions. The temple, 60 by 20 by 30. The house of the forest of Lebanon, just the house of the forest of Lebanon, which was only one of 5 components, 100 by 50 by 30. If there's any mathematical geniuses in here, you work out the volume, 4 times larger. Just the house of the forest of Lebanon was 4 times, by volume, 4 times larger than the temple. So it was a lot bigger. Years to build, we've talked about that, 7 years versus 13. Not surprising, because it was so much bigger. But it does, pound for pound, what it shows is that construction machine got faster and faster and faster, because to build something so much bigger in 13 years compared to something that took 7 says to me that they got more and more efficient and more serious about their construction. Materials. The temple had quarry-dressed stone. We talked about that before. They didn't want the influence or the noise of man at the construction site. It needed to be away. It was reinforcing that this was God's work. The palace was made of beautiful high-grade stone. They didn't have that problem. They didn't need to worry about it. You know why? Because it wasn't God's work. Don't need to honour that principle when it's not applicable for that particular project. And the design, we talked about the fact that David took the design, was given the design directly from God, and he passed that into Solomon for the temple. But we would presume that the palace was not divinely designed. There is no record of that. And if you look at, so there's a couple of archaeologists, this is actually Brother Lane Rittmeyer, who is one of the authorities on this. He has sort of pieced together what he thinks the whole complex looked like that Solomon had. So at the top there you've got the temple, and then down the bottom you've got the palace, right? And you can see, again, just run your eye over that, and you can see visually the temple was huge. The temple was really big, but everything else just kind of dwarfed it by the end. It was a seriously big complex, that palace. If you compare that to another thing, which is, this is another, it's also Lane Rittmeyer. Compare it to that, that's actually David's palace. You can't get a sense of the relative size, but you get a rough feel looking at the scale that it was a lot smaller. It's not unimpressive, but it's considerably smaller than the previous one. So there was lots of differences, right? And that might be fine. Look, let's be honest, none of our houses, I'm pretty sure, none of us live in a divinely designed house, right? So we need to be careful. But it was just so extreme. The magnitude of the difference was just incredible. And I think that's kind of the problem. And just to underline the point, bear in mind that David had just built a new palace. No, I'm not saying just like a couple of years ago, but it wasn't that old, the palace of David. 2 Samuel 5:11, if you're interested, Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David and cedar trees and carpenters and masons, and they builded David a house. So why the new palace? What do you think was wrong with the first palace? Do you think David would have made a bad palace, or do you think Hiram? So Hiram was involved in that. Do you think Hiram would have put a shoddy palace together for David? This is a rhetorical question here. What was this all in aid of? What was this really for? I don't think this was for God. So the palace was quite something. But after that, he just kept going. He went on to build more. And that point is made emphatically in 1 Kings 9, in the context of explaining why Solomon taxed people so much. If you go to 1 Kings 9, we're going to see that. Now, not initially. Initially, we know why he did the taxing, right? It was to provide finances, labour, to build God's temple. Pretty clear. That there was a reason for it. But later on, the anticipated tax relief that was meant to come, so that the expectation was that Solomon would unwind that tax. It never came. It never came for Solomon's subjects. 1 Kings 9, verse 15. Let's read from there. Because there we see, this is the reason of the levy which King Solomon raised, for he built the house of Yahweh, and his own house, and Millo, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hazor, and Megiddo, and Gezer. This is a bit of a bracketed point, I think, for Pharaoh, king of Egypt. This is where Gezer came from. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up and taken Gezer and burnt it with fire and slain the Canaanites that dwelt in the city and given it for a present unto his daughter, Solomon's wife. So that was a wedding present, Gezer, and he sacked it and then he gave it to Solomon. So that's got to be one of the most unusual wedding presents ever. And Solomon built Gezer and Beth Horon the Nether and Baalath and Tadmor in the wilderness, in the land, and all the cities of store that Solomon had, and cities for his chariots, and cities for his horsemen, and that which Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem, and in Lebanon, and in all the land of his dominion. Do you notice a word being repeated there? And. Do you think we're being told something here? I actually think that the second and is the key and, verse 15, second and in verse 15. I actually think, I circled that in my bubble. I actually think that's where he sort of crossed a line, as he just kept on building. That was sort of, where I talked about the two options. Well, that's where he took option 2, and he never turned back, because he just kept on going. We see the same sentiment in verse 19. That phrase, it's this curious phrase, that which Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem. Green's literal renders that the desire of Solomon that he desired to build in Jerusalem. The contemporary English version, not literal, but I think it gets the spirit beautifully. Solomon had them build whatever he wanted. That is exactly what is going on here. He just started building anything and everything that took his fancy. One particularly interesting, it's not the most impressive example, but one particularly interesting example I find is how he expanded the walls of Jerusalem. And I say it's interesting because if you look at it carefully, it was a knock-on effect. It was a knock-on effect because he made this whopping big palace, and then he oh dear, I got to expand the walls, and then it led to another huge project, having to modify the walls of the city because it wouldn't fit properly. And anybody who's ever renovated a house or built a house, I think there's one or two people here building houses at the moment, will know this is the problem. Things snowball. we find emergent work. Our wish list grows. And so perhaps we become a little more involved in the project than we would originally like. And I just see that whole thing with the wall as being a classic example of that. Solomon was becoming more and more like that. He just couldn't stop himself. He couldn't resist doing more and more all over the land. It wasn't Jerusalem. This is everywhere now. He's sort of going crazy. We talked a lot in the previous study about how clever Solomon was in terms of his abilities, and he was brilliant. Particularly that ability he had to draw on the strengths of other people. He was so good at that. But we also talked about how important motives are to God. And here we can see what happens if we focus on using the talents, the resources, the money, whatever, all those things, for things that are not really about God. Sometimes we do this, right? We direct large amounts of time and money and all that sort of stuff at things that if we're really honest with ourselves, they don't really have that much to do with God or the ecclesia, and they're not necessarily wrong, and sometimes, realistically, we have to do some of these things. But when we throw too much focus at those things, it can be quite unhelpful. We've got to be careful. I really think this is one of the most critical points to take away from the study of the life of Solomon. Do not focus on the idolatry and the heathen whim. We will come to that, right? That happened. But I honestly believe that, dreadful though those things were, they were the symptom. They were not the cause. They were not the root issue. You focus on the idolatry, you can completely miss the point. I'm yet to meet a Christadelphian who has a problem with literal idolatry, right? It is a lot more subtle what happened to Solomon than these idols suddenly cropping up in 1 Kings 11, which when you first read the record sort of quickly, you kind of, oh, that was quick. He suddenly started getting into idols. Silly man. It's not what happened at all. It started back here. It started right back here with a man who fairly innocently, I really believe that, started to lose focus without even realising what he was doing. So anyhow, he comes through this phase of building whatever he wanted. And around then, there was another incident that indicated, I think, again, that he was losing focus. There's a really interesting little incident, and it involved actually Hiram, the person who had been working with him and helping him so much. So aside from the deal, and I think it was a related deal, the way it reads, that one around the temple, there was another deal where, perhaps made a little later on, where Solomon was to give some cities to Hiram. And there was going to be an exchange of money for this. And so again, there they are on the screen, Hiram and Solomon wheeling and dealing, as they like to do. We read about this in, if you're still in 1 Kings 9, just look at verse 10 there. We read about this. It came to pass at the end of 20 years when Solomon had built the two houses of Yahweh, the house of Yahweh and the king's house. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, had furnished Solomon with cedar trees and fir trees and with gold according to all his desire. Then King Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. Okay, so it's interesting to note that this little section is set against all those other verses we were just looking at, I think because it's just the same theme that's being built here by the divine mind around Solomon kind of starting to struggle. You were going to see that. I think that's what is happening in this story. So anyhow, it seems like there was this, as I said, there was this deal, cities for gold, if you like. There was this exchange of value, perhaps associated with the other one for the temple construction. But it didn't go very well. Verse 12, we see that Hiram came out from Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him, and they pleased him not. And he said, what cities are these which thou hast given me, my brother? And he called them the land of Cabul unto this day. And that word Cabul is pretty simple. It means worthless. No good. That's what it means, no good. So Hiram did not like the way Solomon had chosen to interpret this deal. But interestingly, he still paid Solomon 120 talents of gold. Presumably that was the pre-agreed amount. And in that sense, this reads to me like he was kind of taking the high moral ground because he didn't like what he was given. We know that. He actually gave them back. He thought they were so rubbish. 2 Chronicles 8 verse 2 refers to the cities which Hiram restored to Solomon. Now that assumes they're the same cities, probably a reasonable reading, but maybe they're not. But if they are the same cities, well, he just kind of refunded them and got, don't know if he got his money back, but he did not like those cities. And I think the interesting thing to do here is just stop and think, well, what is going on here? What actually happened on this occasion? And it's one of those ones where you read, it's a little hard to, it's a little bit cryptic, there's not that much detail given, and you look at different commentators, and it's one of those ones where the commentators don't really agree, there isn't really a dominant sort of answer, and you sort of end up twisting yourself in knots trying to figure out what's going on. But for what it's worth, this is sort of where I got to with it. One thing I'd say for starters is that Solomon shouldn't have been offering up God's land to a Gentile. Okay, the Leviticus 25:23, the land shall not be sold forever, for the land is mine, for ye are strangers and sojourners with me. Leviticus 25:23. So that may or may not have been a problem, depending on where the cities were. So I guess if they weren't within the boundaries of God's land, maybe you could say it was okay. So we don't know for sure. But what we do know for sure, so that might be a factor, but what we do know for sure is that Hiram did not like the cities. And for somebody who we know, we've seen this, who is super duper good at reading people and at understanding what made people tick and what they liked and what they didn't like, to me, what Solomon did here seems a little bit kind of negligent, a little bit willful perhaps. That I think Solomon chose to interpret what was a fairly open-ended aspect of their agreement, a fairly subjective term in the deal, in his favour. Why? Because he didn't want to give Hiram anything decent. He liked his cities. He'd done all this work on them. He didn't want to give them to him. It's like when, I can think of lots of analogies, but anyone who's got kids, you might have seen sometimes one child will sort of get all the pencils or the textures or the crayons, the whole lot. And then someone comes along and they want to have a couple, and they start bickering, and you say, "Hey, come on, give your brother a few. Come on, give him a few," and then you sort of walk off, and then sometimes you might go back, and there's still a disagreement. And say, "Hang on, did you give the?" Yeah, no, yeah. And you look and you go, "Oh, yeah, white, grey, and black." Yeah, that's it. Nice. And that's kind of what Solomon did here, I think. And it left Hiram feeling sort of shortchanged. And although they continued to work together, and they did keep working together for example, on their trade endeavours, the shipping venture they got into, we'll see if we look at that tomorrow in the exhortation. The offence was made. Proverbs 18 verse 19, a brother offended is harder to be won than a strong city, and their contentions are like bars of a castle. This is not the magnanimous Solomon who we saw in those early years, or at the temple dedication even. This was a man, I think, who was starting to lose focus on the things that had actually made him so great. A great indicator of our spiritual health, I think, is how we treat other people, especially with things like this. How do we go when it comes time to meet an obligation? One where perhaps the terms or the requirements are pretty grey, and so we have scope to decide what we're going to do. Do we push it right down our end of the spectrum, or do we do the opposite? Do we aim for the high moral ground? Maybe even suffering ourselves to be defrauded. I think that is one of the most powerful practical phrases in the Bible. Suffer yourself to be defrauded. If you apply that to disagreements, even with people in the world, a tradie does something for you, whatever, other people in the meeting, suffer yourself to be defrauded. It is one of the most practical phrases in the Bible. I love that phrase. And we live in a world that does not does not hold to that standard, where it's the opposite. You got to get what's yours. I talked about negotiation before. Don't exchange anything. Don't give anything up unless you get something back. That is the thinking of the world. But we should be people who are happy to suffer ourselves to be defrauded. Hiram was happy to suffer himself to be defrauded. Solomon, unfortunately, was not. He did not meet that benchmark on this occasion, having once been a man who I think would have done it every single time. Remember how generous he was back there at the start. And unfortunately, I think this is where his troubles were just beginning. Solomon would continue to lose focus as his thoughts shifted increasingly to the pleasures of this life, and all the while he was losing God. It is a sad story, but it's a really fascinating story to see how it will happen, and we will look to consider all those things in our exhortation tomorrow, God willing.